Martin Pickford.
A very nice talk. I was especially intrigued by Moulin-Quignon and the excavation you made. And you showed what you called a sinkhole. What? A sinkhole with a descent of sediment. Yes. What is the sinkhole? What is the surrounding rock of that sinkhole? The reason I ask is it looks to me more like what we would call piping in geomorphology, which is a result of underground erosion in non-carbonate rocks, which then can infill from the surface by mass flow of sediment and what have you, carrying stone tools, fossils, whatever. So I just wanted to know, what's the nature of the substrate that sinkhole was formed in? Was it carbonate rocks, solid carbonate rock like limestone, dolomite, or was it other sediments?
The substratum is a chalk, and we have the same kind of sinkhole in the Carrière Carpentier. And maybe you saw this on the photo that I show you on the picture, on the slide. We have the same type of sinkhole. But for Moulin-Quignon, you can see that we have a disturbed of the form of the different levels into the alluvial formations. No, but the photo that I show you is not a sinkhole. It is the alluvial formation which has been only moved, curved by how to explain, it's difficult for me because Pierre-Antoine will be more able to explain the geology of the site, but it is just disturbed. It is not a sinkhole. We have in Carpentier a sinkhole, but it is clearly observed through the Marne Blanche. Here we have, at the bottom of the sequence of Moulin-Quignon, different levels of gravels, which are the same levels that we have under the Marne Blanche at Carrière Carpentier. We have not found the Marne Blanche at Moulin-Quignon, but it was not a problem because we have found artifacts into the gravels. And if we read the papers written by the past prehistorians about this alluvial formation and the Carpentier quarries, Léon quarries, and they explained that they mainly found artifacts into the gravels, also in the Marne Blanche, but also into the gravels. But for Moulin-Quignon, it was just a disturbance of the levels. It was not a sinkhole, and the substratum is chalk.
Thank you. Other questions? Hélène Roche.
Well, it's not really a question, Marie-Hélène. You mentioned the fact that we don't have too many hand axes in your sites, in the sites in Europe, but that's maybe a good thing because, you know, what we do have sometimes in Africa is accumulation over time, and this is why we have so many hand axes, but it's a really long occupation site with many occupation during time, and which ended with a lot of hand axes, but this is not so good after all.
Yes, I agree with you, but with some site that we have, for instance, Moulin-Quignon could be a short event. But for instance, for Notarchirico or Isernia, we have a huge accumulation of a huge quantity of heavy-duty tools. For instance, at Notarchirico, we have started the excavation, and we have a huge quantity of pebble tools. And in my opinion, it is difficult to admit that only a short event. So many occupation because to find carcasses of mega herbivores. And on this site, we have not a lot of bifaces, but of course the excavation is not so huge, so maybe it is due to the size of the excavation. But for instance, at La Noira, we have open 100 square meters, so it's a huge surface, and we have a huge quantity of flakes, of course, but only 8 bifaces, but a huge quantity of crudely made bifacial tools. So maybe.
Yeah, I think this is really important to highlight the fact that even in so-called Acheulean sites that we think are nicely characterized by these hand axes represent a couple of % of the assemblage, in fact. And so when we have an impoverished assemblage, the end axes might be missing just because of sorting of the material. That leads me to my question. So no end axes east of the Rhine River. What about Markleberg?
I have not seen these collections, but according to the papers, in my opinion, it seems that the bifaces in this part of Europe must be related more to Middle Paleolithic behavior than Acheulean
Stage
behavior.
7, huh?
Yes. For me, stage 7, we are completely into the Middle Paleolithic behavior. So, and if I have not seen the collection, but according to the drawings and the photos, for me, it's more connected to the Middle Paleolithic strategies than the Acheulean strategies. But
yeah, but there is, I would say, there is not such a clear cut between what we used to call Lower Paleolithic,
yes.
Middle Paleolithic in this part of Eurasia. And so that would be a separate invention of end axes. So if it happened once, maybe it happened more than once.
yes.
Professor von Braun.
Thank you. I think we have more and more evidence heard yesterday and now from you that there was great diversity among the early humans. I understand that there was change due to climate change and biosphere change. The environment created pressures or opportunities, and the early humans became more creative, innovative in flaking and tool making. They must have become more curiosity driven somehow. And then, I mean, becoming more artistic, not just with the tools, but also their thinking must have changed. I wonder about why did certain early species disappear. I understand you're focused on when they appeared, where and when, and your previous speakers also talked about appearance. But how about the calendars of disappearance? Do you have thoughts on that? And is that maybe even, that's why I started with my lengthy introduction, maybe there should not be a concept of disappearance, because maybe they evolved and became changed and interbred, but maybe not. But can you tell me about the concept of disappearance and of change? Maybe the early humans became part of us, but so I'm puzzled about the emphasis on appearance rather than about disappearance. We are concerned about the future of mankind or current humankind and its disappearance or change. That's where I'm coming from.
Can I ask something? I want to ask something in more or less in the same line, but from the other point of view. What is the reason that the chimpanzee and this other hominids not disappear and this other disappear? So, it's in relation with it.
Je peux répondre à ta place.
Ah oui, je répondrai après. No, I am not able for answer about this question of disappearance. I am not able, for instance, to discuss about the question of a relationship or not between Homo antecessor and Homo heidelbergensis, because a paleoanthropologist must reply about that. But what I can tell you about the lithic assemblages, for instance, if we observe only the core technologies, the ability to produce flakes, because it is possible to compare before the Acheulean and after, we observe common features between the assemblages. So we can deduce that it is maybe a local evolution because we have the same strategies for producing flakes. But in some sites, from 700 Ka, we have also some innovation that didn't exist previously. For instance, the independency from the stone geometry. They are able to produce more flakes and to manage the volume of the stone, to prepare platforms, some technical feature that attest the ability to go through the stone geometry. So we don't observe this kind of behavior before this date of 700 Ka. For instance, at La Borilla, with the two crudely made bifaces or why not pigs, the core technology are completely exactly the same than for sites of 1 million years ago. There is no innovation among the technology. So for the moment, in my opinion, we have some strong innovation, clear innovation from this date, and we have to explain why. Is it due to multiple arrivals, because I don't think only one, it's impossible, multiple dispersons of hominid groups, population, or why not ideas coming from different places, why not? It could be multiple scenarios, from the Levant, from North Africa, from and so on, and they change the behavior and perhaps the land use patterns. We have not enough data to see if there is a different management of the land use and, for instance, for the gathering of stones. For the moment, we have not enough data to observe that. But we have innovation in coarse flakings, we have innovation, of course, with heavy duty component. So for me, it's an introduction, but I don't know when and from where, by who.
About extinction, it's not just the fate of hominids. I mean, extinction plays a major role in evolution. If you look at any groups of ancient mammals or vertebrates, what you see is mostly extinction. So extinction is a major process. And as for hybridization, incorporation, etc., yes, it exists. It plays a very marginal role in terms of ancient DNA you carry from Neanderthals or something else. We're talking about 2%. So it's leaky replacement with mostly extinction. And as for the chimpanzees, I think luckily, they were not in the same ecological niche than us, because if not, there would not be any chimpanzee anymore for a long time. I think they were having a style of life and use of resource that did not directly overlap with that of large brain hominins in Africa. Well, now it's turning a little bit bad for them, but because we need their habitat also now. Professor Donnell?
Just a couple of general comments. I think I support what you're saying about the Acheulean. But if you look at Eurasia, right across from China to northwest Europe, between latitudes 40 and 50, the hominin presence there is very finely adjusted to climatic change. So the pattern there will be one of repeated abandonment, recolonization, abandonment, recolonization. The second point is that animal populations at the northern limit of their range will be sink populations, which depend upon source populations further south. And where the European evidence is problematic at the moment is that we know about the refugia in Iberia and Italy, but we know nothing worth the name about Southeast Europe, Western Turkey, and that is a major, major gap in our understanding of what these pulses of immigration are coming from or bringing with them. But I think your basic model is absolutely correct here, of discontinuity and repeated episodes of innovation.
More comments or questions? Or you're already too hungry to think on something else at your lunch? So I'm going to close the session. Any comments on the side of the organizers? No?
I wanted to answer also our president. Well, everything you are mentioning do exist. I mean that if you are here, it's because you had ancestors. So there is a real evolution of some species and some genera and so on. But you have also real extension. I mean, Homo naledi is very exceptional now to meet Homo naledi in the streets of Johannesburg or Pretoria. And Homo florensis, for instance, well, I haven't met him either. So extension, as Jean-Jacques Hublin told you, it's normal thing during the whole evolution. But fortunately, transmission evolution also do exist. Otherwise, we would have not had the Académie Pontificale. Sorry.
I should only announce lunch, but I would like to know more about the causality of extinctions. That it is a fact of life, I know, and that species come and go, we know. We have a conference on protection of species and their limitations next month. To understand the causality of causalities, plural, of species extinctions in the context of the changes in biological environment and or human action, these causalities and the deeper causes of it are of great interest to, I think, the science community.
We speak often about movements of humans in the past as if it were they were some kind of migrations or things like that. I think it's a really wrong way to depict the reality, because migration implies some kind of intention. I think most of the time what we have is dispersal in a biogeographic environment that is favorable. In the same way a biogeographic environment can be favorable, it can also become not so favorable. Some years ago we wrote a paper with my colleague Professor Wilry Brooks from Leiden University, testing these models of ebb and flow for Neanderthal expansion in Europe. And this idea that when there are a glacial event, there would be a retreat of population in refuges in Southern Europe, and then an expansion again when the climatic conditions were better. In fact, what we found is that what we're mostly dealing with is local extinction, is not movement, is that simply in places where the conditions become bad, the local population does not survive. And so they survive in other parts where it's good, but where the carrying capacity is not sufficient. Gradually, their demography crashes, and at some point there is nobody. So they don't see themselves getting extinct, but they get extinct locally.
Sorry, asking one in addition. Is it fair to ask that something may have happened 300 to 500,000 years ago when the early humans who had roamed the world by then disappeared? Do you have a calendar of disappearances of the early humans? We have looked at the maps in Asia and Europe and Africa. Was that the time when things changed and or disappeared?
I think, well, I'm going to speak about that in 2 hours, but I think the most visible, I would say, extinction that we have is, and which is sort of synchronous, is that one that occurred when our own species started to expand out of the Near East, after expanding out of Africa and after expanding out of tropical areas of Asia. And then what we see is that in different parts of especially of Eurasia, but maybe also in Africa, where we have other forms of hominins living, there is a replacement with a little bit of incorporation, a little bit of absorption, but it looks like it's a one-way ticket. And in the end, it's only us that colonize the rest of the planet, including places where there were never humans before.
We are occupying all the spaces, all the territories. And I think that the lion, to continue to exist, he must evolve. He must not be a lion. And we are occupying all the spaces. So it's a pity, but I think in some times we will have dogs, cats, cows, horses, maybe, and wheat, and it's going to be difficult if we don't take an action on this.
Brigitte, Sonu.
Je parlerai pas tout. Sorry, I won't speak exactly from humans, but referring to great apes. If I go back to the Miocene, in the late Miocene, Eurasia was peopled by great apes, by hominoids, and they disappeared at the end of the Upper Miocene in Eurasia. Only one went through. It was the orangutan, Pango, because it was living in tropical places. Not the chimpanzee, the orangutan in Asia. And the orangutan remained in Eurasia, in this part of the world, because it was tropical. And what happened to the other ones? They disappeared slowly. It's not from one day to the next day, slowly. And it's probably a problem of physiology of a female. They have to adapt from a tropical environment to all of a sudden of more you say in Europe, an environment more temperate environment. And probably they couldn't do that because the environment was different. They couldn't feed properly. Because in a tropical environment, you can feed over time. You move from trees to trees. If you have less trees, less fructification, your groups won't be able to survive because they don't have a food, basically. And they slowly disappeared. Maybe the female couldn't actually adapt their physiologies to this schooling. So we found them in Africa. In Africa, they had the chance to live in a very tropical area with a lot of forests. So when human came, and this is the main thing today. First of all, we don't know what happened to the chimpanzees and gorillas since they were in Africa. How many species, subspecies, up to now? We have almost no record about their recent history. So first of all, we may have several extinctions of groups, and we don't know about them because we don't know them. And the other thing today is not only they are disappearing because they have been pushed back by humans, more and more pushed, but not only because of the impact of humans, they're aggressive as an animal, but also they destroy the environment. And this destroyed environment won't come back. So unless the chimpanzees will adapt to these new environments, but I think they won't have time because there's very small populations, then they will disappear. But this disappearance is not a natural one per se, it's a human action. As is the past, it was more disappearance related to the total pattern of climates and day life. I don't know if I answered your question.
Professor Alem Zeged.
It sounds that the questions that came from our hosts are very fitting, and probably we would have benefited more if we had longer time to discuss those
But
issues.
we are in the general discussion now,
yeah,
so it's time to discuss.
Yeah, so that's good. The question of extinction, as both Jean-Jacques and Yves said, is fundamental in the history of life in general. Actually, it's more of the rule than the exception. If you go back in time to the Permian or the Cretaceous, I'm talking now over 65 million years, if not 250 million years, there were moments where over 90% of life just found its own demise. But coming close to home, You could see yesterday Eve was pointing to the two solutions to the same problem, pointing to Paranthropus. These are the robust species of humans on the one hand, and our genus Homo on the other hand. And if we assume that separation, we call that speciation or bifurcation, happened at around, let's say, 3 to 2.8 million years ago, the robust group made it all the way to around 1 million years ago, and you don't see them after that. So that is actually one of the flagrant examples of what speciation and extinction can do. Whereas our genus seems to have been successful, leading to the emergence of our species 300,000 years ago, that group called Paranthropus, or the robust group, they were very successful for almost 2 million years, but then we don't see them after 1 million years ago. And this is just an example on our line, but there is a monkey that we know now exists only in Ethiopian highlands. It's the Gelada baboon. It's beautiful, they're called Therapithecus. There were at least 1, 2, 3, 4 species hanging out with our ancestors, and you don't see them anymore. There were successive species of elephants that Eve documented in the Omo. You can see the different stages of evolution happening between 4 to all the way to less than 1 million years. And what you find in Africa is not actually the Loxodonta that we have in Africa now. It's the Asian version that we have in Africa, but you don't see them after that. So all that is to say, both in the history of the Earth, life, but also specific to our lineage, hominins, extinction is the exception and is really flagrantly represented by the Paranthropus or robust group.
Thank you. The right Professor Berger?
I also think that perhaps we as paleontologists, archaeologists, don't emphasize the paucity of the record that we're dealing with and the very tiny windows that we have into the past. If you listen closely to the presentations, the fossil hominid record is known from quite literally a handful of sites across the continent of Africa and around the world. The archaeological record that we're talking about, often the gaps are tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years between a known and an unknown. And it was brought up yesterday that often the gaps will be filled in time as we make discoveries, but they may be occupied by these species. That extinction may not be 1 million years for Paranthropus. Very personally, discovering Homo naledi is a very disturbing thing for me because it is likely it has a great history before that. It carries many primitive characters, and it's certain almost that it has a history after that. And I think it is important that we acknowledge both the wealth of these records, but also how narrow and small often these spots of evidence are, and have an understanding of what those windows are actually showing. They're often in very specific types of preservation environments, caves, for example, in our case, caves sometimes in Europe, sometimes they're gravel deposits, sometimes they're widespread, like the areas that are worked in Ethiopia, but the actual localities may be very small. And so we have to acknowledge that our record is often, and time is big. We glibly roll off 10,000 years, 100,000 years, 200,000 years. These are massive amounts of time where, the entirety of this history is encompassed in a fifth of that we're sitting in today of 10,000 years, so I think it's important to acknowledge that.
Yes, it's very important to highlight that for most of the groups we are talking about, we don't really know the first, the real appearance date and the real extinction dates. We have a first occurrence in the fossil record, we have a last occurrence, but that does not give the whole story. And to have the philosophical thought about extinction, I would say even at an individual level, in fact, is death and sex. That makes evolution so, I would say, complex and so somehow progressive, because without sex, which is a recombination of the genome of two individuals, and death of their descendants as individuals, evolution would be very, very, very slow.
Just an example. I worked on proboscideans, and among proboscideans you have mastodons, and among mastodons you have Anankus, who was a mastodon in Eastern Africa. And at the time of the turnover I was talking about yesterday, many species were successful in finding new solution and good adaptation to the new environment. But mastodon not. And it was, well, for a paleontologist, it was pathetic to see the normal teeth of the Anankus, and then the teeth which some sort of effort to have new cusps, and the cusps are less and less good, and finally the species disappeared. So when you are a paleontologist, when you have a bone like that, instead of saying sorry, of looking at the bone, you're looking at the bone and the bone before and the bone after. And it was the case. If you look at a tooth of an Anankus, you see the normal tooth, and then the tooth which, well, I cannot say more than efforts to survive, efforts to find a solution, and no success, and finally no more Anankus for several million years.
Okay, maybe we should.
I would suggest
close
we
the
listen to you in the afternoon. And
yes.
I want
There's going to be a very interesting
yeah.
talk at 2:30.
Yeah, I want to thank you for chairing this session, and we better go to lunch.
Okay, thanks.